Hey, what's up? All right, in this video, I want to talk about 3 low-end mixing mistakes that are killing your mixes. And not only are these mistakes, but these are kind of commonly preached tips and commonly held techniques for mixing the low end that actually are not going to work very well if you're mixing heavy music like rock, hardcore, and metal. And I think in particular, the third one here is going to be kind of surprising to you. But let's start with one that you can pretty much completely ignore if you're mixing heavy music, and that is sidechaining. So if you don't know what sidechaining is, it's basically using the input or the signal from a secondary track to affect the processing of what you're working on the primary track, you could call it. The most common way to use sidechaining for low end is to have your bass track and a compressor on the bass track. But instead of that compressor being triggered and reacting to the bass track itself, it's actually reacting to the input that you're sending in from the kick drum track. So the kick drum track is controlling the compressor on the bass track. So basically you have your bass signal going like this, and then when the kick hits, it's going to turn down the bass track using the compressor. So the kick transient is going to trigger the compressor to turn the bass down. So people use this to basically free up space in the low end. So if you have a lot of low end energy in the bass track, but also a lot of low end energy in the kick, you can use sidechaining to turn down the bass only when the kick is hitting and do it very quickly so you don't really notice, and therefore the low end of your kick can cut through and the low end of your bass can come through as well. Now it sounds pretty good in theory, right? And this is pretty commonly used, most commonly used in electronic genres that are very sub heavy and also like hip hop. You know, we're talking where the kick drums and the bass just have massive sub information, especially even really down low, you know, 50, 40 hertz. And you're dealing with really long kick sounds as well, like, you know, the 808s that are just like boom versus, you know, a metal kick, which is just kind of just a really quick punch, right? It's useful in those genres and it's a common technique there. And honestly, it makes sense there. But for those genres, that sub information and just how hard it hits you in the chest and punches you in the chest when you're like driving in a car with, you know, a bunch of subs, or you're at a club or whatever, that really defines the genre. That defines the sound of a mix in those electronic or hip hop or similar genres like that. But that's not what defines a heavy rock mix or a metal mix. What defines our mixes is mid-range. For one thing, our kick drums are not 808s with a ton of length and tail to them. They're really quick, sharp, usually tons of high end to cut through a dense mix, and they're a lot faster. They're just really fast transients. They're not these long, big booms of a kick drum, right? Plus, there's a lot more kicks happening in most, if not all, rock and especially metal songs. I mean, when you think about a hip hop or some sort of electronic song, usually there's a lot of space between the kicks, right? That's why they can have the kicks to be have so much length and decay to them. For us, we're talking about a lot of kicks in every bar, sometimes even really fast double kick. So it just basically by common sense, you can't have the same amount of low end and sub in a song with lots of kicks like that that you can in, let's say, a hip hop or electronic song, where the kicks are a lot more sparse and there's a lot more space for that energy to live. I mean, if you've got a technical metal song and you're sidechaining the bass with the kick, and the kick is doing the really fast double kick patterns, I mean, it just kind of starts to break down. It doesn't really make sense. Like, why would you have the compressor just dipping like this all the time with all these kick drums, or constantly like this? Even if it's slightly less busy, it's just like, it almost becomes pointless at that point. So because of all these factors, this is a technique you pretty much can ignore for heavy music, and you don't have to worry about it. Even if your kick and bass share the same range, which I'm gonna talk about in a few minutes, you still don't have to worry about this, because again, we're not dealing with these really big, long, fat kick drums. We're dealing with kick drums that are fast, punchy, and just hit and go away very quickly. It's not like the bass and the kick are sharing that same energy for very long. It's a very fast transients. You know, we're talking tiny fractions of a second where these frequencies are overlapping and peaking. So sidechaining is just something that you don't have to go through. It's an extra step that is not necessary working on this type of music. And I've got to tell you, of 10 years of producing and mixing records professionally, I used sidechaining one time, and that was for a very unique scenario where I had this really gritty bass track that almost sounded like a synth, that it was just a constant signal level of low end, and then I had really spaced out drum hits that also needed to sound really heavy, so I sidechained the bass with those drum hits just for that one section of the song, and it worked out, because otherwise I had this really big solid brick block of a bass track, and these hits were not coming through enough. So that's when I used sidechaining, and that was the only time I used it in 10 years of making records. So, you know, you can go to listen to some of them for yourself if you want, and see, you know, if I'm missing anything by not using the sidechain. Okay, so that covers the first low-end mixing mistake. Number 2 is obsessing over subs and ignoring the low mids. Question for you. How much time do you spend focusing and tweaking and working on the frequencies below 100 hertz? Now, how much time do you spend working on frequencies between 100 and 500? Chances are you're scooping out and cutting a lot of those frequencies in the low mids, and you're spending a lot of time trying to control and isolate and emphasize those sub-frequencies below 100 hertz. The power in your mix, specifically the power that's going to translate across any speaker system, is really living in the low mids and the mid-range. I used to spend hours obsessing over those sub-frequencies in my mixes and just worrying about it, constantly referencing, going back and forth, never quite getting it right. And when I finally did feel like I had it right and really slamming in the subs in my studio, I'd take it out to the car or somewhere else, and I would have no power in my mix. Then I switched to mixing on NS10s, and now I honestly spend a total of 5 to 10 minutes in total across, you know, an entire day mixing, checking my low end, and I do that using headphones, and I just reference a couple tracks, and I make sure that my sub energy is in the right ballpark and that it's feeling good and it's not sounding messed up in any way, and that's it. Otherwise, I'm focusing on the low mids, I'm focusing on the mid-range, getting my power on smaller speakers with more limited response so that I know it's going to translate everywhere. If you don't have speakers like this, like NS10s or small, really limited speakers to mix on, then just mixing at low volume helps a lot because it doesn't emphasize those subs as much, and you can really focus more on the mid-range when you're listening at lower volumes. This is something that's a little bit hard to grasp unless you try it for yourself. You know, try in your next mix to spend a lot less time focusing on the sub frequencies than you do on the mid-range, and listen at low volumes and see what it does for the translation of your mixes. If you want to get a little more info and go deeper on this specific topic, then I talk about it a little bit more in my studio tour video and in my 3 mixing mistakes to avoid video. All right, the third low-end mixing mistake that I see people making and that I see taught most often is too much carving. So a popular mixing technique for the low end especially is to basically create individual separate spaces and frequency ranges in your low end for the bass to live and the kick to live. Some people describe this as, you know, you don't let your kick go as low as your bass goes frequency wise, or vice versa. You don't let your bass go as low as your kick goes. So maybe you'd high pass filter your kick at 40, so you have that energy really low on the kick, but then you high pass your bass at maybe 60 or 70 so that it's not going down to where that kick is living. Now I gotta say, I don't think that this tip is entirely nonsense or not useful at all. In fact, I think that I do this kind of instinctively in a mix. You know, like let's say I'm doing a technical fast metal song, there's tons of double kick, then chances are just automatically I'm gonna follow my ears and my gut and give a lot more sub information and sub energy to the bass track versus the kick track where it's like tons of double kick. That's just gonna build up too much, right? It's just kind of common sense. That's kind of naturally where you would go with that. Also, if you're dealing with really low tuning, then chances are you're going to give more sub space to the bass than to the kick. But the really important part of what I just said there is that I don't pay attention to the specific frequencies necessarily. I pretty much just go with my gut and feel that out. And I don't think that you need to mix by numbers or have any sort of predetermined rules of where your kick should be versus where your bass should be. And by the way, it's okay for these to overlap. In fact, they need to overlap. I think that a lot of what problems that I hear in people's mixes right now is that they're too separated. Everything is too isolated. You're taking this concept too far, and so things sound really disjointed in your mix. And sure, they're clear and they have their own space, but you're missing that energy and that glue that holds your mix together. And that goes for the high mids, the mid-range, but also in the low end. It's okay for those things to overlap. It's okay to boost the same frequencies on a bass and a kick. So if you're doing this, if you're sitting down to mix and you're deciding that your kick is going to live in XYZ frequencies and your bass is going to live in these other frequencies, then guess what? You're mixing by numbers and you're mixing with your eyes, and you're not using your ears to guide your decisions first and foremost. You know, in theory, creating those separate frequency pockets should work, But in practice, that's not always how it comes out. Like I said, you could lose energy and glue and character in your mix. And through the years, every time that I tried to implement one of these rules or kind of more, I call them scientific or mathy approaches to mixing, then my mixes, maybe they sounded a little bit more clear and separate, but again, they just lacked energy. They didn't have the glue. It didn't sound like pro mixes that I was referencing, because it was just, everything was just too isolated. And then because of that, the energy just dies. So although I might do this kind of instinctively by following my ears and my gut, I don't give it really a second thought logically in my brain when I'm mixing. I will routinely boost 60 or 65 hertz on a kick and a bass in the same mix, and it doesn't even faze me at all. I'm not worried about that. And I don't think you need to be either, because here's the thing. If you're doing those boosts and it sounds good to boost 60 on a kick, and it also sounds great to boost 60 on the bass, then just go with it. And if you're getting too much low end buildup as a result of that, guess what? You'll hear that and you'll adjust something. You'll turn the low end of the kick or the bass down, whatever feels right to you, and you'll go with your gut. The ultimate takeaway here is to mix with your ears and your gut, not with your eyes, not with math, not just with your mind. Ultimately, guys, yes, this is kind of a technical job, but we're still making music, right? We're making art. The idea is for it to sound good and feel good. And just focusing on what you see on the screen and what you think should make sense, or following these arbitrary rules, is not the thing that's going to result in a killer mix that actually moves the listener. Just follow your gut and your ears and mix. All right, that wraps up my 3 low-end mixing mistakes that could kill your mixes. Again, they are sidechaining, obsessing over your subs and ignoring the low mids, and doing too much carving and separation between your kick and bass. If you want to get more recording and mixing tips for heavy music that might be a little unconventional, might not fit with the things you've been hearing and learning so far, but will actually make your mixes and your productions sound a lot better, then head over to hardcoremusicstudio.com. I've got a free guide there for you to download right now. And when you sign up to my email list, you're also going to be getting my best recording and mixing advice. So thanks for watching. Please leave me a thumbs up or even a thumbs down. That's all right, I can take it. And drop a comment below on this video, and make sure you're subscribed for more, and we'll talk again soon.